bell above the door of the Redemption Bank chimed a thin, tinny note against the oppressive midday silence. Outside, the sun hammered the dust into a fine, choking powder that coated every surface in a film of pale grit. Inside, the air was cool and still smelling of old paper and oiled brass. Jedediah Jed Stone stood before the teller's cage, his reflection a ghost in the polished bars. He was a man built of long, lean lines, his face a map of sun-creased leather, etched by a life that had demanded more than it had given. His hat, stained with the sweat of a dozen hard seasons, sat low on his brow, shadowing eyes the color of a faded sky. He was depositing the meager earnings from a month of breaking horses, a task that made his bones ache in ways they hadn't when he wore a sheriff's star. The young clerk, barely old enough to grow a proper mustache, counted the bills with nervous efficiency, his movements jerky and uncertain. He, like most of the townsfolk, treated Jed with a kind of weary reverence, as if he were a monument to a past they were all trying to forget. That's when the bell chimed again, sharper this time. 4 men filled the doorway, their forms silhouetted against the blinding glare of the street. They wore long dusters and masks that concealed their faces, but it was the man who stepped forward who commanded the room. He was taller than the others, his posture unnervingly poised. He moved with a liquid grace that was at odds with the brutal efficiency of his men, who fanned out their revolvers, appearing with a series of slick, metallic clicks. "Good afternoon, gentlemen," the leader said, his voice a low, cultured baritone that carried a chilling lack of haste. It was a voice that belonged in a lecture hall or a parlor, not a stick-up. "Please remain calm, and this unpleasantness will be concluded with minimal fuss." Panic seized the room. The clerk's hands froze over the stack of bills. An old rancher by the far wall raised his hands slowly, his eyes wide with fear. Jed didn't move. He kept his hands flat on the counter, his gaze fixed on the leader. He had seen enough violence to know that sudden movements were invitations to death. The leader's eyes, visible through the slits in his mask, found Jed's. There was a flicker of something in them, recognition perhaps, or amusement. "You," he said, his voice dropping slightly. "Jedediah Stone, the son of the lion. It has been a long time." Jed's blood ran cold. The man knew him. One of the thugs shoved the rancher against the wall, while another vaulted the counter, jamming his pistol into the clerk's ribs. "The vault," he snarled. "Now." The clerk, trembling, fumbled with the keys and stumbled toward the heavy steel door at the back of the room. But the leader held up a hand, a gesture of almost theatrical restraint. "Not the vault, my friend. Not yet. We are not here for the town's money." His gaze returned to Jed, intense and unwavering. "We are here to collect on a debt." He turned his attention to the terrified clerk. "You will open safe deposit box number 47. Now." The clerk's eyes darted to Jed. Box 47 was Jed's. It held the few things he had left of his father, his service medals, his retirement papers, and the one thing Jed valued above all else. "Do as he says," Jed said, his voice a low rumble. He kept his own hands in sight, his body a study in coiled tension. He was unarmed, a deliberate choice he'd made the day he'd unpinned his father's star, but his instincts were screaming. The clerk, sweating profusely, retrieved the box and placed it on the counter. The leader stepped forward, his boots making no sound on the wooden floorboards. With gloved fingers, he lifted the lid. He ignored the medals and the papers, his hand going directly to the small object wrapped in worn velvet. He unwrapped it, revealing a silver locket tarnished with age. It was plain, unadorned, save for the initials E.S. engraved on its surface. Elijah Stone. The man, Silas Kane, held it up to the light, a faint, satisfied smile playing on his lips, hidden behind the mask. He clicked it open, glanced at the faded portrait of a young woman inside Jed's mother. and then snapped it shut. He slipped it into his pocket. "This will suffice," he said, turning to leave. His men were already backing toward the door, their guns still trained on the frozen occupants of the bank. Jed's voice cut through the silence, hard as granite. "That locket has no value to you." Silas paused in the doorway, half-turned. The sunlight framed him, making him an imposing dark figure. "Oh, it has no monetary value, I agree," he mused. "But its worth is measured in memory, in promises broken, in lies." He looked directly at Jed, his eyes cold and sharp as splintered ice. "Some debts can never be repaid, Sheriff." He used the old title like a weapon, a deliberate twist of the knife. Then, as quickly as they had come, he and his men were gone, vanishing into the sun-blasted street, leaving behind a cloud of dust and a silence thick with shock and a deeply personal violation. The clerk collapsed against the counter, gasping for air. The old rancher slowly lowered his hands. But Jed did not move. He stared at the empty safe deposit box, a hollow ache spreading through his chest. Silas Kane had not just robbed a bank. He had stolen the last piece of Jed's father, the last tangible link to a past Jed had built his entire life upon. And in doing so, he had declared a war that had been simmering in the shadows for years, a war Jed now knew he would have to finish. In the minutes that bled into an hour after the robbery, the bank became a hive of frantic energy. Sheriff Calloway arrived, a young man whose face was still too smooth to carry the weight of his badge with any real authority. He strode in with a misplaced swagger, his hand resting self-consciously on the butt of his pistol, his questions a torrent of nervous formality. "What did they look like, Mr. Stone? Did you recognize any of them? Their voices, their horses?" Jed remained by the counter, his gaze distant, fixed on the swirling dust motes in the shafts of light slanting through the windows. 4 men, long dusters. The leader was tall, spoke like a city man. They knew what they were coming for. Calloway scribbled furiously in a small notebook, his brow furrowed in concentration. "My deputy is gathering a posse. We'll ride out within the hour. We'll catch them, Mr. Stone, you have my word." Jed finally turned to look at the young sheriff. He saw the earnestness in Calloway's eyes at the desperate need to prove himself, and he felt a pang of something that might have been pity. "They'll be long gone." Jed said, his voice flat. "They planned this. They knew the patrols, the schedules. They knew I'd be here." The townsfolk who had gathered murmured amongst themselves. They looked at Jed, their expressions a mixture of sympathy and a quiet, unsettling relief that it was his problem, not theirs. They remembered Sheriff Elijah Stone as a legend, a man who had tamed redemption with grit and an iron will. They saw his son Jed as the quiet echo of that legend, a man who had worn the star for a time, but had given it up after his father was killed in a supposedly heroic shootout in Blackwood Gulch. They saw him as a relic, a reminder of a wilder time they were grateful to have left behind. "Leave it to the law," Jed said, old man Hemlock, the general store owner. "You're not the sheriff anymore. It's not your fight." The words were meant to be kind, but they landed like stones. Not your fight. The stolen locket in Silas Kane's pocket said otherwise. That locket was more than silver and a faded photograph. It was the anchor of his identity. His father had given it to his mother on their wedding day. After she passed, Elijah carried it every day until his own death. He'd told Jed it was a reminder that even in a world of violence and chaos, there were things worth protecting, things pure and good. For Jed, it was the embodiment of his father's legacy, a legacy of honor, sacrifice, and unwavering justice. Later that evening, Jed sat in his small, sparse room above the livery stable. The space smelled of hay and saddle leather. A single lantern cast long, dancing shadows on the walls. The safe deposit box key lay on the small, rickety table beside his bed, now a useless piece of metal. He ran a hand over his face, the rasp of his stubble loud in the quiet room. He remembered his father's funeral. The whole town had turned out. They'd called Elijah a hero, a martyr, who had died facing down the notorious Blackwater gang alone. They'd buried him on the hill, overlooking the town, his gravestone a proud testament to his sacrifice. Jed had taken up the badge, then driven by a burning need to live up to that impossible standard to be the lion's son. But the weight of the legacy had been crushing. Every decision was measured against what his father would have done, every failure a personal stain on the Stone family name. After 5 years, he'd stepped down, unable to escape the shadow of the man he could never be. Now that shadow had been desecrated. Silas Kane's words echoed in his mind. Some debts can never be repaid. It wasn't a random taunt. It was a message steeped in a history Jed didn't understand. The precision of the robbery, the specific targeting of his safe deposit box, the theft of an item with only sentimental value. It all pointed to something deeply personal, something that reached back into the past, into the life of the sainted Sheriff Elijah Stone. Jed stood and walked to the window, looking out over the sleeping town. Calloway's posse had ridden out hours ago, a flurry of hoofbeats and bravado, chasing ghosts in the dark. They would find nothing. Jed knew it in his bones. This wasn't a matter for a posse or a young untested sheriff. This was a reckoning. His decision settled over him not with a crash, but with a quiet, cold finality. Hemlock was wrong. This was his fight. It had always been his fight. He just hadn't known it until now. He would hunt Silas Kane not just to reclaim a piece of silver, but to reclaim the truth. He had to understand the debt his father had apparently left behind, a debt now being collected from his son. He turned from the window, his movements deliberate. He strapped on the gun belt he hadn't worn in years. The weight of the Colt at his hip felt familiar, heavy, and necessary. He was no longer Jedediah Stone, the horsebreaker. He was his father's son again, but this time he wasn't chasing a legend. He was hunting a ghost. The first light of dawn was a pale gray smear on the eastern horizon when Jed rode out of Redemption. He moved quietly, his horse's hooves muffled by the thick dust of the main street, avoiding the sheriff's office and the well-meaning but useless advice of his neighbors. He carried little: a bedroll, a canteen, a bag of jerky and hardtack, and the heavy Colt revolver at his hip. He was a man stripped down to a single purpose. He didn't follow the direction Calloway's posse had taken. They would be searching for a large group, a trail of hoofprints leading out into the open plains. Jed knew better. A man like Silas Kane wouldn't be so obvious. He was methodical, intelligent. His escape would be as carefully orchestrated as his attack. Jed circled the town, his eyes scanning the ground, looking not for the trail of 4 horses, but for the sign of one. A leader who would separate from his men, who would take a less traveled path. He found it an hour later, a single set of tracks, veering south toward the jagged, broken country of the Badlands. The horse was shod with custom-made shoes, a small notch on the left forefoot, a detail Jed had noticed on Silas's mount during the brief, chaotic exit from the bank. It was a faint trail easily missed, but Jed's years of tracking rustlers and fugitives had honed his senses to a razor's edge. He followed it, the sun rising at his back, casting his long shadow before him like a specter. For 2 days, he pushed onward the landscape, growing more desolate and unforgiving with every mile. The world bleached to bone-white and shimmering heat haze under the relentless sun. The silence was absolute, broken only by the wind whistling through rock formations that looked like the skeletal remains of ancient giants. This was a land that stripped a man of everything but his will to survive. On the 3rd day, he found the first sign that he was closing in. A recently abandoned campsite tucked into a shallow arroyo. The embers of the fire were still warm. A single half-smoked cigarillo lay in the dust. Jed picked it up. It was made of expensive dark leaf tobacco, the kind you couldn't buy in a place like Redemption. It smelled of Silas Kane's quiet arrogance. Near the fire pit, he found another clue, a spent cartridge. It was from a volcanic repeater, a rare and powerful weapon favored by men who valued precision over noise. Jed knew he was being tested, or perhaps toyed with. These clues were too easy, left by a man who was either careless or supremely confident. Jed suspected the latter. Silas was leaving a trail of breadcrumbs, drawing him forward, leading him toward a confrontation on his own terms. The thought sent a chill down Jed's spine, but it didn't deter him. It only hardened his resolve. The confrontation came at dusk. The trail led him to a narrow canyon, its walls glowing a deep, bloody red in the setting sun. As he rounded a sharp bend, he saw him not Silas, but one of his men, a hulking brute with a vacant expression, sitting by a small fire, cleaning his pistol. He was alone, posted as a sentry. Jed dismounted silently, tethering his horse to a scrub brush and drawing his Colt. He moved like a ghost, using the deepening shadows as cover. He was 20 yards away when the man looked up, his eyes widening in surprise. He lunged for his rifle, but he was too slow. "Don't," Jed's voice was a low growl echoing off the canyon walls. The man froze his hand, hovering over the rifle stock. He slowly raised his hands, a sneer twisting his lips. "So the old sheriff's boy has some fight in him after all. Kane said you'd come." "Where is he?" Jed asked, his pistol steady. The man laughed, a harsh grating sound. "Gone. He left me here to slow you down. Said you were predictable." Anger flared in Jed's chest, hot and sharp. "Talk, or the next sound you hear will be this hammer falling." The outlaw's sneer faltered. He saw the cold promise in Jed's eyes. He's heading for his stronghold, a place up in the Ghost Mountains. But you'll never find it. And even if you did, you wouldn't get out alive. "I'll take my chances," Jed said. "Where in the Ghost Mountains?" The man hesitated, his eyes darting around as if searching for an escape. He made his move, then a desperate, foolish gamble. He kicked the small campfire, sending a shower of sparks and embers toward Jed, and dove for his rifle. Jed fired. The shot was deafening in the enclosed space. The man grunted, a dark stain blossoming on his chest. He collapsed backward, the rifle clattering on the rocks beside him. Jed moved forward cautiously, his gun still raised. The man was dying, his breath coming in ragged, wet gasps. Jed knelt beside him, the smell of gunpowder and blood thick in the air. "It wasn't worth it." Jed said, his voice rough, with a weariness that went deeper than the trail. The outlaw coughed, a trickle of blood appearing at the corner of his mouth. He looked up at Jed, his eyes glazed with pain and a strange, spiteful clarity. "You don't know anything, Stone," he wheezed. "You think this is about a trinket. It's about history. It's about Blackwood Gulch." The name hit Jed like a physical blow. Blackwood Gulch, the place his father had died a hero. "What about it?" Jed demanded, leaning closer. The man's lips curved into a final bloody smile. "That's where it all started," he whispered, his voice fading. "And that's where it'll end." His eyes went vacant, his head lolling to the side. He was gone. Jed remained kneeling for a long moment, and the man's final words echoing in the sudden silence of the canyon. Blackwood Gulch. The place was a shrine in his mind, a sacred ground of martyrdom and sacrifice. But now the name was tainted, spoken by a dying thief, as the source of a conflict Jed was only beginning to comprehend. He rose slowly, the pieces clicking into place with a dreadful logic. Silas Kane wasn't just a random outlaw. His connection to Jed, to his father, was tied to the very event that had defined the Stone family legacy. The journey was no longer just a pursuit. It was an excavation. He had to go to Silas's stronghold not just for the locket, but for the truth buried in a place called Blackwood Gulch. He was no longer just avenging a theft. He was questioning a hero. The journey into the Ghost Mountains was a descent into a harsher, more primal world. The terrain grew treacherous, a chaotic jumble of fractured peaks and shadowy canyons that seemed to swallow the sky. Jed pushed his horse to the limits of its endurance, the dying outlaw's words, a constant nagging refrain in his thoughts. Blackwood Gulch. The name had become a splinter in his mind, festering with questions he was afraid to answer. He followed the sparse clues Silas's man had given him, combined with his own knowledge of the territory. He was looking for an old miner's trail, long since abandoned, that supposedly led to a hidden valley. For days he saw no sign of human life, only the circling vultures high above patient witnesses to the unforgiving landscape. The loneliness was a physical presence pressing in on him, forcing him to confront the crumbling foundations of his own history. Who was Silas Kane? How did he know his father, and what really happened at Blackwood Gulch? The official story was simple. Sheriff Elijah Stone, acting on a tip, had gone alone to confront the notorious Blackwater gang at their hideout. He'd taken down half the gang before being overwhelmed. A hero's death. Clean, simple, inspiring. But Kane's robbery, his words, as the dying man's whisper, they all suggested a different story, a more complicated and darker truth. Jed's quest for the locket was transforming into a painful pilgrimage toward a truth he increasingly feared would shatter him. He finally found the stronghold late one afternoon. It was a small, fortified settlement nestled in a box canyon, invisible from any distance. A single narrow entrance was guarded by armed men. It was less an outlaw camp and more a small, self-sufficient town, complete with a blacksmith, a stable, and a large central building that looked like a cross between a bunkhouse and a fortress. This was Silas Kane's kingdom, built on foundations Jed couldn't yet see. Infiltrating it would be suicide. Jed retreated, setting up a cold camp on a high ridge that offered a commanding view of the canyon entrance. For 2 days he watched his spyglass pressed to his eye. He studied the guards' routines, the comings and goings of patrols, the rhythm of life in this hidden world. He saw Silas Kane, only once a distant figure emerging from the main building, moving with that same unnerving calm he'd shown in the bank. He looked less like an outlaw leader and more like a landed gentleman surveying his estate. Jed knew a direct assault was impossible. He needed a way in a moment of distraction. It came on the third night in the form of a supply wagon rumbling up the trail. Jed moved under the cover of darkness, a silent shadow flitting between boulders. He reached the wagon just as it slowed for the final approach to the gate, dispatching the driver with a swift, non-lethal blow to the back of the head. He hid the man's unconscious body in the brush, pulled the man's dusty hat low over his own face, and took the reins. His heart pounded against his ribs as he urged the mules forward. The guards at the gate were lazy, their attention focused on a card game by lantern light. They barely glanced at him, waving him through with a gruff command. "Leave it by the storeroom. Silas wants it unloaded before morning." Jed guided the wagon into the compound, his eyes scanning everything, committing the layout to memory. He parked the wagon where instructed behind the main building. The compound was quiet, most of its inhabitants asleep or drinking in the saloon-like structure near the center. This was his chance. He slipped away from the wagon and made his way to the large central building, Silas's headquarters. The windows were dark, save for one on the ground floor, where a low lamp burned. Jed crept closer, peering through the glass. The room was an office meticulously organized. A large oak desk stood against one wall, a leather-bound chair behind it. Bookshelves lined the other walls, filled with volumes on engineering, geology, and history. This was the den of a scholar, not a common bandit. And on the desk, laid out under the lamplight, was a large, heavy ledger book. Jed found a side door unlocked. He slipped inside, every nerve screaming. The air smelled of leather, tobacco, and something else, the dry, dusty scent of old secrets. He moved to the desk, his gaze falling upon the open ledger. The page was filled with elegant, precise handwriting. It was a record of accounts detailing expenses for mining equipment, blasting powder, and payrolls. The dates went back over 15 years. But it was the names at the top of the column that made the breath catch in his throat. Kane and Stone. His fingers, trembling slightly, traced the second name. Stone. He flipped back a page. The entries became more detailed, almost like a journal. October 12th. The vein is richer than we ever imagined. The assay reports confirm it. We'll be the richest men in the territory. Elijah is like a boy with a new toy. He speaks of building a legacy for his son. Jed felt a wave of dizziness. Elijah. His father. His father and Silas Kane were partners. He kept reading, his horror growing with every line. The entries painted a vivid picture of two men partners who had stumbled upon a fortune, a massive silver lode in the heart of the Ghost Mountains. They had worked in secret, pouring every cent they had into the venture. His father, the town sheriff, had used his position to keep prospectors and authorities away from their claim. Then the tone of the entries began to change. March 5th. Elijah is growing distant. He is in debt deeper than he let on. The bank in Prescott holds the note on his land. He is getting desperate. He looks at me differently now. April 21st. He spoke of a buyout today. Offered me a pittance for my share. When I refused, I saw something in his eyes I'd never seen before. Greed, cold and absolute. The final entry was dated May 3rd, the day before his father had supposedly died at Blackwood Gulch. May 3rd betrayal. He did it. He set a charge in the main tunnel while I was below checking a support beam. He collapsed the entrance, leaving me to die in the darkness. He meant to take it all. I heard him just before the rocks fell, telling his men, the men I now know were the Blackwater gang, that the plan was in motion. He was going to fake his own death in a shootout, pin it on them, and disappear with the fortune. I am trapped. The air is running out. But I will not die here. If I survive this Elijah Stone, I swear on my soul, I will tear down everything you have built. I will take back what is mine, and I will make your son watch as your legacy turns to ash. Jed staggered back from the desk, the ledger falling from his hands and hitting the floor with a heavy thud. The room seemed to tilt, the shadows pressing in on him. It was all a lie. His father wasn't a hero. He was a thief, a betrayer, a man who had tried to murder his own partner for greed. The heroic stand at Blackwood Gulch was a fabrication, a cover story for a crime. Silas Kane wasn't a villain driven by random malice. He was a man consumed by a righteous 15-year-old quest for vengeance. And the locket. Jed's mind raced. He pulled it from his memory. Plain silver. No, not entirely. He remembered now a small, almost invisible seam along its edge. It wasn't just a locket. It was a container. He searched the desk, his hands clumsy with shock. He found a small, ornate box. Inside, resting on a velvet cushion, was a folded piece of parchment. It was a deed. The original deed to the silver mine, the lost Spanish bride, registered under the names Silas Kane and Elijah Stone, and with it a small, intricately wrought brass key. A key that would fit a hidden lock, a key small enough to be hidden inside a silver locket. The truth crashed down on him with the force of a physical blow, shattering his world, his identity, his past. His entire life had been built on a heroic myth that was in reality a monument to a terrible sin. His quest was not for justice. It was the inheritance of a crime. And the man he was hunting was the man his own father had wronged beyond measure. The cold, hard reality settled in Jed's gut like a lead weight. He was the son of a liar and a would-be murderer. The legacy he had struggled to uphold was a sham. The grief he carried was for a man who didn't exist. He stood in the silent office, the damning evidence of his father's treachery scattered around him, and felt the ground completely fall away beneath his feet. The man he had set out to bring to justice was in a terrible way the victim. And he, Jedediah Stone, was the living embodiment of a debt that could never be repaid. He fled the compound before dawn, and the ledger tucked into his saddlebag, the truth a searing brand on his soul. He rode without direction, letting the horse pick its way through the pre-dawn gloom. The mountains that had seemed majestic and challenging on his way in now felt like a prison, their jagged peaks mocking him. He made camp in a hidden cove miles from Silas's stronghold, but he couldn't rest. He built a small fire, the flames doing little to ward off the profound chill that had settled deep in his bones. He pulled out the ledger and read it again, hoping to find some mistake, some alternate explanation. But the words were clear-cold and irrefutable. His father, Sheriff Elijah Stone, the hero of redemption, had been a monster. He saw it all now with sickening clarity. His father's debts, his quiet desperation in the months before his death, the way he'd pushed Jed to be honorable, as if trying to instill a virtue he himself had abandoned. It had all been a performance. Jed stared into the fire, his reflection a wavering distortion in the flames. Who was he now? If his father's legacy was a lie, then what did that make him? His entire life, his sense of right and wrong, had been tethered to that lie. He had defined himself in relation to his father's heroism first, by trying to emulate it, then by feeling he'd failed it. Now he knew the failure was not his. The failure was the foundation itself. A wave of fury washed over him, hot and blinding. Fury at his father, for his betrayal, for the weight of the lie he'd forced his son to carry. Then came the shame, a crushing, suffocating weight. He was the son of the man who had wronged Silas Kane. Every look of respect he'd ever received from the people of redemption felt like a fraud. He was complicit in the lie, even in his ignorance. What was justice in this twisted mess? His initial quest had been simple: retrieve the locket, avenge the personal slight, and bring a thief to justice. But now, Silas Kane was owed a debt. A life of fortune, 15 years of his existence had been stolen from him. His vengeance, while brutal, was not without cause. Did Jed have any right to stop him? He thought of Kane's words in the bank. Some debts can never be repaid. Kane wasn't talking about money. He was talking about the life his father had tried to extinguish in that collapsed mine. He was talking about the theft of their shared dream. As the sun rose, casting a cold, impartial light over the desolate landscape, Jed's turmoil began to settle into a new grim resolve. He couldn't restore what his father had taken from Silas. He couldn't undo the years of hatred that had festered in the man's heart. But he could stop the cycle. His father had started this with an act of greed and violence. Silas was continuing it with vengeance. If Jed did nothing, the violence would consume redemption, a town built on the profits of a lie. His mission was no longer about avenging a hero or reclaiming a memento. It was about atonement. He had to confront Silas Cain not as a lawman hunting an outlaw, but as the son of one sinner facing another. He had to end the cycle of violence his father had begun. He would not be defined by his father's sins, but by how he chose to answer for them. He looked toward the mountains where Silas Cain's fortress stood. Justice was no longer a simple matter of a badge and a gun. It was a tangled, bloody mess. And his path forward was not to restore a tarnished legacy, but to tear it down completely, so that something honest could finally take its place. He saddled his horse, his movements sure and steady for the first time since reading the ledger. He knew where he had to go. Not back to redemption, not yet. He had to go to the source of the original sin. He had to go to the lost Spanish bride mine. The sky was a bruised purple canvas churning with clouds that promised a storm. A low rumble of thunder echoed through the peaks as Jed approached the abandoned mine. The entrance was a dark, gaping maw in the mountainside, partially obscured by a rock slide and overgrown with thorny brush. This was the place where his father had committed his greatest sin, and where Silas Cain had been reborn in darkness and a thirst for revenge. Jed dismounted, leaving his horse tied in a cluster of withered pines. The air grew cold, thick with the scent of damp earth rot and the faint metallic tang of forgotten silver. He drew his Colt, the feel of its worn grip, a small comfort in the oppressive atmosphere, and stepped into the mine. A few yards in the light from the entrance vanished, plunging him into absolute blackness. He struck a match, the small flame pushing back the shadows to reveal rotting support beams and the glittering promise of silver in the rock walls. He lit a lantern he'd brought, its golden glow casting long distorted shadows that danced like specters. He found Silas in the main chamber, a vast cavern where the primary vein had been discovered. He was standing before the wall of rock that had collapsed 15 years ago, the place where Jed's father had tried to seal his tomb. The silver locket was in his hand, open. He wasn't looking at the portrait, but at the empty recess where the key had been. "I was wondering when you would piece it all together," Silas said without turning around. His voice was calm, conversational, but it echoed with a chilling resonance in the cavern. Did the ledger make for illuminating reading? It did. Jed said, his voice tight. He kept his lantern held high, his pistol lowered, but ready. Silas finally turned. His face, no longer hidden by a mask, was sharp and intelligent, but etched with a profound weariness. His eyes held a fire that had been burning for a very long time. "Then you know," he said, his voice dropping. "You know that your sainted father was a common thief? That he left me to die in this hole, choking on dust and darkness so he could steal our future?" I know Jed admitted the words tasting like ash. What he did was wrong. There's no defending it. A flicker of surprise crossed Silas's face. An admission I expected, denials. I expected the blind loyalty of a son. This is unexpected. He took a step closer. "So why are you here, Jedediah? To apologize for your father's sins? It's a little late for that." "I'm here to end this," Jed said. "You've made your point. You've revealed the truth. But bringing it to redemption with fire and guns won't fix what happened. It will just create more graves." Silas laughed, a dry, bitter sound. "Redemption. That town was built on my silver. Its prosperity is the fruit of my betrayal. It deserves to burn. But I am not an unreasonable man." He took another step, his eyes gleaming with a strange intensity. "I have an offer for you. You are your father's son, but you are not your father. You have a strength he lacked, integrity, the ledger, the deed. They give you a claim as much as me. Join me. Together we can take back what is ours. We will build an empire on this mountain, an empire of real power, not the cheap imitation of honor your father preached in the streets. It was a tempting offer, a chance to reclaim a fortune, to have the power he'd never known. For a fleeting second, Jed considered it the allure of shedding his past and embracing a future of wealth and influence. My father made a deal in darkness, Jed said, his voice steady, and it corrupted him. I won't make the same mistake. A flash of lightning illuminated the mine entrance, followed by a deafening crash of thunder that shook the very ground beneath their feet. The storm had broken. Rain began to lash against the mountainside. Silas's face hardened, his brief flicker of hope turning to cold fury. A pity. I truly thought you were different. But you still cling to his name, his town. You are a stone after all, and the stones must be erased. He moved with startling speed, kicking over a stack of old timbers. They crashed down between them, separating them in a cloud of dust. In the confusion, Silas drew his volcanic repeater, the weapon he'd used with such precision. A shot rang out, the bullet whining past Jed's ear and ricocheting off the cavern wall. Jed dove behind a rusted ore cart as another shot splintered the wood above his head. Gunsmoke filled the air, acrid and choking. This was it. The final reckoning fought in the very place the feud was born. It wasn't a duel of quick draws. It was a desperate, brutal battle fought in the flickering lantern light and the disorienting flashes of the storm outside. Jed returned fire, his shots echoing Silas's in a deadly chorus. They moved through the labyrinthine tunnels, a deadly game of cat and mouse. He told you he was a hero, didn't he? Silas's voice taunted him from the darkness. Did he tell you how he begged for his partner's investment, how he swore on your life that he was an honorable man? Jed gritted his teeth, ignoring the verbal barbs, focusing on the sounds of movement. He saw a shadow and fired the bullet, striking a support beam near Silas's head, sending splinters flying. He was weak, Silas roared, his voice filled with 15 years of rage. He saw a chance at greatness, and he flinched. He chose a comfortable lie over a difficult truth, and you are just the same. They met again in a narrow passage. Silas's repeater was empty. He threw it aside and drew a long hunting knife. Jed holstered his pistol, unwilling to shoot an unarmed man, even this one. They crashed together, a tangle of limbs and fury. The fight was raw, primal. They slammed against the tunnel walls, their grunts of pain lost in the roar of the storm. Silas was stronger, fueled by years of simmering hatred. He forced Jed to the ground, the point of his knife hovering over Jed's throat. This is for the years I spent in the dark. He snarled, his face inches from Jed's. For the life your father stole from me. Jed struggled, his hands gripping Silas's wrist, the knife's edge biting into his skin. He looked past Silas, his eyes catching on a network of cracks in the ceiling above them. Cracks that radiated from a support beam that was splintered and groaning under the strain. It was the same section Silas had mentioned in his ledger, the place he was inspecting when his father set the charge. With a final desperate surge of strength, Jed twisted his body, rolling them both directly under the weakened beam. He shoved Silas hard, breaking his grip, and scrambled backward. It's over, Silas, Jed yelled over the storm. Not until the name Stone is nothing but a memory, Silas screamed, lunging forward again. At that moment, a tremendous bolt of lightning struck the peak above them. The entire mine shuddered violently. The groaning of the weakened beam turned into a sharp crack. Dust and pebbles rained down from the ceiling. Silas looked up, his eyes widening in horror as he realized his mistake. The support gave way completely. With a deafening roar, a section of the tunnel roof collapsed, a torrent of rock and earth, burying Silas Kane where he stood. The dust was so thick, Jed couldn't breathe. He scrambled back, choking and coughing as the cavern settled into an eerie, ringing silence. The storm outside raged on, but inside the mine, the battle was over. Silas Kane, a man who had survived being buried alive once, had been reclaimed by the very mountain that had forged his obsession. Jed stood there for a long time, his lantern casting a lonely light on the fresh tomb of his enemy. He felt no triumph, only a vast, hollow emptiness. The cycle of violence was broken, but the cost had been immense. He had not fought for justice or for honor, but to simply stop the bleeding. He turned and walked out of the mine, leaving the ghosts of his father and Silas Kane to the darkness, and stepped out into the cleansing rain. The ride back to redemption was slow each mile, a heavy measure of the burden Jed now carried. The storm had passed, leaving the air clean, and the desert washed in the pale, fragile light of a new day. He rode not as a conquering hero, but as a penitent. In his saddlebag, the ledger felt as heavy as a gravestone. He entered the town in the late afternoon. The townsfolk who saw him stopped and stared. They saw the exhaustion etched on his face, the fresh cuts and bruises, the grim set of his jaw, and they knew his hunt was over. Sheriff Calloway met him in front of the jailhouse, his expression a mixture of apprehension and respect. Stone Calloway said, his voice quiet. "We heard the thunder from the ghost mountains. Figured it was either God or you." Jed swung down from his horse, his bones aching. He didn't answer right away. He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out the heavy ledger. He handed it to the young sheriff. "Silas Kane is dead." Jed said, his voice rough. But he wasn't the only villain in this story. Calloway took the book, his brow furrowed in confusion. Jed looked past him at the faces of the people gathering in the street, people whose lives and prosperity were built on the lie of Elijah Stone's heroism. "My father wasn't murdered by the Blackwater gang at Blackwood Gulch," Jed announced, his voice carrying in the still air. There was no gang. He tried to murder his business partner Silas Kane to steal his share of a silver mine. He faked his own death to cover the crime. It's all in there. He nodded toward the ledger in Calloway's hands. Everything redemption is built on. It started with a lie. A wave of murmurs and disbelieving gasps swept through the crowd. Old Man Hemlock stepped forward, his face pale with shock. "That's not possible. Elijah Stone was a hero." "No," Jed said, his gaze unwavering. "He was just a man who made a terrible choice. We've been living in the shadow of that choice ever since." He turned to Calloway, who was staring at the ledger as if it were a venomous snake. "The deed to the mines is in there too. By rights, that mountain and everything in it belongs to Silas Kane's next of kin, if he has any. If not, it belongs to the territory, not to this town." With that, he had shattered their founding myth. He had torn down the statue of their sainted sheriff, leaving nothing but the truth of a flawed, greedy man in its place. He expected anger, denial, outrage. But as he looked at their faces, he saw mostly a stunned, sober silence. The lie had been a comfortable one, but the truth, however ugly, had its own unassailable power. Calloway finally looked up from the ledger, his eyes meeting Jed's. The young sheriff stood a little taller, the uncertainty gone from his face, replaced by a quiet gravity. He had been handed a truth that would redefine his town and his role within it. "What you did, bringing this back, that took courage, Jed. More courage than chasing a man with a gun." It was an absolution Jed hadn't expected. A transfer of moral authority from the son of a false hero to a young man now tasked with building a future on an honest foundation. Jed simply nodded, turned, and walked away, leaving the town to grapple with its broken past. A week later, redemption was a different place. The truth had settled over it like a quiet, cleansing rain. The initial shock had given way to a somber period of reflection. The name Elijah Stone was no longer spoken with reverence, but with a quiet, complicated sadness. The town had lost its hero, but it had gained something more valuable, a chance to be honest with itself. Jed stood on the hill overlooking the town before his father's grave. The proud headstone which once read, "A hero who fell in the line of duty," now seemed hollow. Jed reached into his pocket and pulled out the silver locket. He had found it in the mine near where Silas had fallen, as if the mountain itself had offered it back. He didn't open it. He knew the face it held, and he had made his peace with the man who had carried it. He didn't destroy it or throw it away. Instead, he gently placed the locket on top of the headstone, leaving it to tarnish in the sun and rain. He was leaving the past where it belonged. The weight of his father's legacy, both the lie and the truth, was no longer his to carry. He had forged his own path, one of painful honesty, and in doing so had found his own form of redemption. He walked back to the livery, his steps lighter than they had been in years. His horse was saddled, his meager belongings packed. There was nothing left for him in redemption. He was no longer a haunted relic of a bygone era, but a man at peace, free to write his own story. As he mounted his horse, ready to ride out into the vast, open country, a small voice called his name. A young girl, the baker's daughter, ran up to him, her face beaming. She held out her hand. In her small palm was a freshly picked apple, red and gleaming in the morning sun. "For the road, Mr. Stone," she said shyly. Jed looked down at the simple, honest gift. It wasn't a reward or a payment. It was a gesture of a community that had chosen to look forward, not back. A small, simple sign of hope and rebirth. He smiled a genuine smile that reached his eyes for the first time in a decade and took the apple. "Thank you," he said softly. He turned his horse toward the horizon, no longer riding away from a past that haunted him, but toward a future he could finally call his own.